So really excited to be here. So I'll kind of try to make the intro quick. So my name's Nick. I am the CEO of a company called Gainsight. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'll tell you a little bit about what we do, but really talk about kind of practical use cases for what we've tried to do with some of this technology. So kind of share some learnings from that. So just for some context, at Gainsight, and I think a lot of companies in this room, there's one thing to take big data and apply it to B2C problems, where effectively you have huge numbers of consumers with very similar types of data points and similar behaviors and things like that. It's another thing to actually apply it into B2B problems where every customer is a little different. And that's what my talk's going to be about, is basically what's it like when you apply big data technology and specifically machine learning to, predicting which prospect is the best lead, predicting which customer is likely to churn, predicting which support case is the right one to work on next, those types of problems. And in that world, you still have Yarn, you still have Mesosphere, you have MapR, you have Hadoop, but unfortunately you also have salespeople, right, that actually have to act on all this stuff. And that's the biggest challenge. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens when people kind of meet data, what are some of the unique challenges that happen as part of that. So just one slide on context. Gainsight, we basically take data and try to help B2B companies use data to do a better job driving success for their clients, and in the process do a better job retaining clients and getting them to spend more money over time. And we do that for lots of large B2B companies in SaaS and open source, hardware, software, et cetera. So a little bit about us. Okay. And today about 250 customers, 275 employees. We have raised a lot of money, that kind of thing. Okay, so before I get started on the talk, I do have a confession to make. I will fail the white sock test today, unfortunately, that you talked about. But growing up, I was quite a nerd. I was very significantly nerdy, like probably a lot of people in the room. I was one of those people that had far more computers than friends. So that test was always off. And whenever this photo flashes up, I have very fond memories. If you don't get this, then you were less nerdy than I was. So big Dungeons and Dragons guy growing up. But one of the things that has carried with me to this day is I'm one of those really annoying people that gets really annoyed anytime somebody confused. Oh, sorry, one last thing. I'm raising my son in my footsteps. It's my son here. And I get to say, Luke, I'm your father, which is pretty cool. But I get very annoyed anytime somebody confuses Star Wars with Star Trek. And so you either one of those people or you're the other people that are annoyed at those people. But yet I figured out as I was preparing for this talk that that's actually the perfect analogy for using big data in B2B, where in a way the challenge is, do you use data and you kind of go with data, or what a lot of people in B2B's intuition, because a lack of data historically, is to just use their intuition, use the force, right? So that's actually to some extent like the clash in B2B is between data and the force. Now, most B2B people are not really Jedis, though they think they are, but actually a lot of the things I'll talk about in this talk are that last mile, really, and it's obviously a little tongue in cheek. But the last mile of all this cool technology and like what we've struggled with just in terms of how do you take that and turn that into changes in behavior for salespeople, for customer service people, that type of thing. So I'm basically going to go through 5 challenges quickly and then talk about kind of some of our learnings from those challenges. And again, this has nothing to do with Gainsight's business, probably something a lot of you might end up running into. All right. Challenge number 1. So anyone can figure out what this slide is saying? Garbage in, garbage out. So it's funny because pretty much every data science project in the history of time, at some point somebody says, yeah, garbage in, garbage out. And it's actually totally not helpful because you still have to finish the project, right? But this is a very, very common kind of summary of one of the challenges people have. And I feel like people don't think deeply about it enough, so we do a lot of projects for our clients where we'll analyze data about their customers and what was happening before the customer decided to leave. That's often one of the things we look at, right? And so that when we dive into it, you can call it garbage, but actually there's really a lot of good reason why data is messy in businesses. I'll give you some examples. The first one's really fun. So one of the most common things you'll see in these businesses is what I kind of consider, business schema drift. The basic idea that you'll start out and your company will get started and they'll say, great, we're using Salesforce, NetSuite, Oracle, something like that. We're going to track how much people are spending. We're going to track revenue, right? But then at some point along the way, something happens, the business changes, there's a new CEO, and they're like, we're going to calculate revenue differently. And they call the field revenue 2 in the system, right? And then later on, like somebody gets fired, there's a reorg, they implement a new CRM system, and it's called final revenue, right? And then later on after that, it's final revenue, and of course, use this revenue, right? And the funny thing is, like, this is actually real. If you've done a real project, and you go into like a Salesforce.com implementation or some kind of a database, you'll see this all the time, right? So you're a data scientist, you're a software vendor, you're trying to do some analysis, and what do, right? Which one of those is right? And so this is the thing that's I'm trying to point out is just saying garbage in, garbage out is kind of like just throwing your hands up, right? The reality is there's actually a good reason why this happened. At every given point, there was logic why they made the changes. Maybe the naming wasn't very good, right? But besides that, it was actually very logical, but you have to figure out what are you going to do about this. Obviously, there's a lot of techniques to then kind of merge those all together and figure out when things changed. Another example of this is, common key. So you'll see this so much if you go into B2B problems where, people will be like, I really want to take my support data and my sales data and my marketing data and do some stuff to predict which leads are the best leads, right? Which is great. And then of course there's no key between those different systems. And, it says GE here and it says General Electric here. And the business person you're dealing with doesn't have any idea what a key is, right? So this is a real life problem a lot of companies have. As they go forward, they often implement master data management, if you guys know what that is, where you basically try to come up with standards for this. But in a lot of companies, this is the reality. Another example, again, really practical problems. When you go into a company, a lot of times you ask them who's your customers. And it's actually a very non-trivial problem. So I might sell to GE, which has different divisions and different departments. I might have marketing technology get sold through ad agencies into different brands, right? I sell to different users. What's a customer? It's not even clear, right? And so again, these sound simple, but they're so important. Another one is kind of drift in time. So you look at a whole bunch of data over 5 years. And the customer says, I've got 5 years worth of data, right? But in those 5 years, they got bought by a private equity firm. They introduced new products. They fired their CEO. They redid their pricing. And how relevant is all that data over those 5 years? You can put it into a model. You can come up with results, but those results are probably totally useless, right? So again, this is a real set of challenges I think a lot of companies run into when they try to apply this into real life. Okay, this is one example. Second example. Okay, so if you talk to almost any B2B company, one of the challenges I run into is they're like, Nick, the problem is all of our customers are different, right? They're all snowflakes. Every one of them is a little bit different. And so you're going to try to run this into some kind of model, come up with some predictive model to figure out who's going to churn or buy my product or whatever. It's really challenging. And so, what things you run into there, right? Companies where they have different products bought by different customers. And so you can't treat them all the same because they're actually different behaviors, right? Companies that have different use cases. This actually even Box is one of our customers, right? And Box, you can use it for almost anything, right? DocuSign's a customer. You can use it for anything, right? And so these companies where you could look at a usage pattern or a support pattern, but it's looking at apples and oranges. So figuring that out is really, really important. Another example is in B2B, unlike a lot of B2C use cases, customers spend different amounts of money. And that might mean they mean different amounts of value to you. But also, the bigger the customer, the more likely there's some kind of customization. And so now again, you run all these customers through a model, and it turns out this one customer is on a totally different path, so your model is totally useless, right? And so again, my point is that you have to really be able to handle this kind of high variance in the data set. And then finally, there's all kinds of things you wouldn't know from looking at the data, right? So in our business, kind of predicting churn, what the number one predictor of customers retaining is? If the customer CEO is friends with the vendor CEO, right? And that's not something you're going to see in the data. And so this is something where in B2B, unlike B2C, it's actually much more nuanced in terms of problem set. So that's challenge number 2. Challenge number 3. Okay, so this is a meme from a couple years ago. If you New Yorkers probably get it. So I've gone into so many companies where they'll be like, Nick, this is awesome. Okay, I'm really excited about applying predictive analytics to all my business, to my leads and my sales and my customers. And I'm like, awesome, great. So tell me your big business. You're like, well, we just started a couple months ago. We got 20 customers. None of them are live yet. And I'm like, what are you gonna do? But they actually obviously they read all the blogs and they think that they can apply it to them. But the reality is most companies, the sample size is far too small. They're just too few data points over too little time. And so in this, just diving into a little more detail, the model, if you kind of think about a business funnel, it makes a lot of sense, right? Companies have a lot more visitors to their website than leads, than opportunities, than customers, than active customers, than churns, right? So if you're in a business like mine where you're trying to predict churns, you have a tiny number of data points, right? There's actually very few churns in most companies. If they have tons of churn, it's probably bad business, right? So there's actually an interesting problem where this waterfall means it's hard to do predictions further down the stack. It might kind of make sense. All right, the fourth challenge So, this is awesome. We actually have a great data science team, and I don't come from a data science background, semi-technical, but not data science background, but our data scientists produce these amazing models, and then they show me the slides, and I'm like, this is so amazing, and nobody's gonna understand this at all. It's gonna be like the Matrix, where one person, the Neo gets it, but Neo's probably not gonna be in our meeting, right? And so most likely. So what are we going to do to explain this? Because my amazing data science team shows me awesome graphs like this, right? They're like, this model is so great. Look at it. Like, wow, AUC. I know it stands for area under the curve, but like most people don't. And so then how are they going to interpret this, right? And so figuring out how you explain that this model is actually something you should use, right? And you want to just be like, look, we're really smart. We did the work. Just trust us, right? But it doesn't work like that in real life. I mean, you have in your head, you're presenting this and the customer's thinking, what percentage of the time is this right? That's what they want to hear, right? And you're like, well, it doesn't work like that because actually we did a random forest model. I can't tell you exactly like that, right? I can explain to you depending on what your trade-off of false positives and false negatives is, where you can be on that curve that we showed you. But they're like, just give me a number. And so it's very hard to explain how good the model is. And I think that's a real challenge people have. You're sitting in the meeting and you want them to just believe you. You feel like their lack of faith is disturbing. But the reality is that they need something, some evidence, some simple way to understand the model. And then kind of the last thing. Okay. So now, Lord Vader actually has something we don't have, which is the ability to drive change very easily. So you have this great model and you've convinced the executives, right? You've convinced them what the area under the curve is. You've come up with some way to measure the model. But now that executive has to convince the salespeople, the support people, the customer success people in our business to do something different, right? Because up till now, they've just been calling the leads in order. They've been calling the customers in order. And how do you get them to actually do something different? This is probably the biggest challenge in this whole process. Because the reality is, what happens is they'll start implementing your model and they'll start using it, right? And the first time I called one of those supposedly A leads and they were totally not a fit, right? So they find one counterexample and obviously the whole model is wrong. Or one of our best prospects was listed as a B, so the model's obviously wrong because that prospect, I know they're great, right? Now, who knows if the prospect's actually great because now it's their intuition versus the data, but they think the intuition's right. Or that customer shows green in the system, but they're unhappy. Or I called the at-risk customer and they're totally fine, right? So they will actually almost like look for the examples of where the machine is wrong. And so this actually, I think practically in a lot of B2B use cases where a lot of projects fail is you do all the work and you get it all the way to the end of the users. And then the users are like, okay, I found one counterexample. And I actually think it's a lot like us living day-to-day life, right? Where we watch the weather reports and probably the smarter folks of us trust the weather reports. But a lot of people still to this day will be like, okay, I watched the weather report. It was wrong. And so from now on, I'm just going to go with my gut. And sometimes it just feels like rain, right? And I just feel that it's going to rain, right? And I don't trust the weather report. And so I think a lot of B2B users still live in this world. So those are kind of the 5 things we run into. Now just kind of 5 quick suggestions and we'll go into Q&A. So kind of mapping to those. First one, data quality. So I mentioned there's all this variance in data, all different types of data changing over time. So one of the things I found is totally simplistic is, I go into clients now and I'm like, look, your data from 4 years ago is going to be completely useless. I have no idea what changed in your business. I just know it's useless. So we have to figure out how many data points we can get out of the last 6 or 9 months or 12 months, right? Something like that. Second one, I think in most mature businesses, if you're selling a project to a larger company, you've got to break it down into segments. There's almost no company where all the customers are uniform. So you've got to break it down by product line, by channel. You've got to build multiple models. We often have to do that. Third one. So because there's not enough data points, the sample size is too small. I think in a lot of situations, you've got to actually go one step higher in the stack. So for example, with us, people want us to predict churn, right? But the truth is they haven't had a lot of churn. So you can't predict it. There's not much data to predict, right? But, we can say, hey, what do you intuitively know is going to cause somebody to stay? And they'll be like, well, I know if they're, running reports in the system, they're probably going to stay. Okay. Let's predict what's going to cause them to run reports in the system, right? So you use a little bit of intuition to move up the stack and get more data points. That's at least what we try to do. The next one, the model understanding kind of how that model is and how it works. This is one thing we've been doing a lot of is just coming up with very simple metaphors. Like, for example, how many times better is this than random? Which I think we've found clients get a lot more than other explanations of models. So, if you take the top 20% of your predictions in this particular cohort, they're going to be 5 times better than a random guess. And I think most people at least understand that a little better than, for example, the area under the curve. And finally, driving change, which I mentioned is the hardest one. At the end of the day, you've got to figure out how you take the humans out of it. To be honest, it's a lot of how do you make it more automated? Use more marketing techniques, right? Less dependence on the salespeople to do something. Make it simpler for them. But if you spend all your time in the project on the top 4 and the rest of the process, and then it dies at the end, it's still a failure. So really think through that. So I close out with obviously the best quote from Star Wars: "Do or do not. There's no try." You still have to go do it, because I think this is going to change businesses. But there's some real practical challenges I think we have to deal with as we go into this. So with that, let's dive into questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Very awesome. Tell us about the Gainsight.
Yeah. So, we're basically solving one of those problems, which is, companies have, lots of customers oftentimes in a finite amount of time. They have people that work with those customers. They might call them account managers, customer success managers, support people. And they want to make sure those customers are getting value for whatever they purchase, whether it's a product or service, and also staying with them, ideally buying more over time. So we use data to help companies focus their time on the right customers at the right time, the ones that might be at risk of leaving, getting to them early, the ones that might be ready to buy more, helping the salesperson figure out what to sell them.
Great. Do we have questions? Yeah, one over there.
Thanks. This is going to be a little bit in the TV commercial side of things for you, but it's a hot space, and I've heard of other companies in the space, lead space, and companies, or maybe it's called lead spend, I can't remember, but something like that, and a few others, and I think Gartner's now started to write a report on the space. Can you just tell us a little bit about what differentiates you from some of the other players?
Yeah, so we're not in the leads. I was using that as an example. So there's companies in B2B that use predictive analytics to solve lead scoring problems. We're not in that at all. There's lots of great companies in that space. There's companies that use it to predict customers and which ones are at risk of churning or ready to buy more. That's the space we're in. That's called customer success management. That's the category we're in.
So to follow up on that question, so in the customer success management, as always, when the new category, there are a lot of players, and you seem to be being able to dominate that category. I mean, you grow faster than the others. What do you think? One or two things you do differently, or what makes you more successful than all the others?
Yeah, mainly sock selection. That was the biggest early on. No, honestly, I think we have great competitors and lots of good folks in our space. Some spaces tend to end up being a power law where one company ends up getting more of the space than the others. In other spaces, there's a lot of players, right? Ours is probably ending up a little bit more of a power law. And we think about that a lot. Like, why is that happening? It's honestly, there's a ton of stuff to do. So it's like a lot of categories you guys might be in business where it seems simple on the outside, and as you dive in, it's like actually you have to build a data infrastructure, do predictive on it, clean the data, drive automated emails, workflow, et cetera. So frankly, it's just been a lot of kind of like startup cost, and we've been able to build a very expansive product, raise a lot of money, and have a product that just does a lot more than anyone else. And the other thing I think is we went after larger customers early on, and that's allowed us, it forces you to build a bigger product, right? There's pros and cons to it, by the way. There's lots of companies that get killed by going after larger customers. But for us, we built a very sophisticated product because we had to do it for large companies. So.
Good. One over there. Oh.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. At what point do you take the very end user experience saying, look, that was green, but that person's leaving, or vice versa, and then go back and integrate it into your model? What's your process for taking that type of level of intuition and saying, look, at some point, maybe we need to rejigger? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think that, first of all, you have to, obviously, it's pretty clear, rerun models, right? Because things change, just like I talked about, things change. So you got to rerun your models no matter what, which would capture, in general, the places where the model was wrong in the future that it was right in the past. So, but I think another thing I've learned is, there's historical modeling and, machine learning and so on. But then there's the ability to experiment. And I actually think there's really nothing better than experiments. So the A/B testing. A/B testing is very hard in reality because finding two groups that are equally alike, and then being willing to put one group through a suboptimal experience is hard, right? Right. But I actually think that to answer your question, you got to rerun the models, and you got to be willing to do some A/B testing to really incorporate in that real world feedback.
Great. One last question over there.
Can you talk a little bit about your tech stack?
Yeah, totally. So it's evolved a lot over the years, but it's the problem we deal with is high variety. It's like the volume is nothing compared to consumer companies, right? But the variety is massive because we have everything from like survey text data to obviously lots of numerical values to lots of actually every customer schema is different. So we need to have a very flexible schema, et cetera. So today we use a combination of Postgres, Mongo, Redshift, and we actually use, if the customer is Salesforce, we run some queries live on their platform. And then we blend all those together, run it in Amazon, and then kind of push it back primarily into the CRM system that they're using to then drive different actions and things like that. So combination of AWS services, a little bit of Heroku as well, Redshift, MongoDB, Postgres. It's funny because I think that's like early on I was like, okay, so what's our database strategy going to be? And now I'm like, it's like for the day, right? Like, because you can change it. Like, by the way, we're going to do Spark, and we'll probably, maybe after the sales pitch, I'll do MapR and Datamir and everything else, right? Too, right? We can use everything. Like, that's a very interesting versus like the old world where you're like, we're an Oracle shop, we're a .NET shop. That doesn't exist anymore. So.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.